What happens when people dare to challenge the authority God Himself established? This isn't just another ancient story. It's one of the most terrifying moments ever recorded in the Bible, when the earth itself opened its mouth to swallow the rebels alive. Today, you'll discover how Korah, Dathan, and Abiram led a revolt against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. They accused them of controlling the people, of using their spiritual position for power. But what they didn't realize was, they weren't just challenging men, they were challenging God. And when that happens, the consequences are immediate and devastating. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand why spiritual rebellion isn't just a danger from the past. It's happening today, and the warning from this story might be the most urgent one for your life right now. Imagine standing in the middle of a vast desert, surrounded by thousands of people. The heat burns your skin, the sand stings your eyes, and in every direction, all you see is wilderness. You've been walking for months, trusting in leaders who claim God speaks to them, following commands that, at times, seem impossible to understand. And then, voices start to rise, whispers turn into rumors. And suddenly, men you've respected, men with influence, begin to say out loud what others have only dared to think in secret. Why do Moses and Aaron get to be in charge? Aren't we all God's people? Don't we all have the same right to lead? That's exactly what happened when Korah, Dathan, and Abiram decided they had enough. These weren't just any men. Korah was from the tribe of Levi, the same tribe God set apart for holy service. He wasn't some outsider, unfamiliar with the ways of God. He was from the inner circle. He carried responsibility. He had status. And yet, deep inside, something festered: pride, ambition, dissatisfaction, the dangerous belief that he could do better than Moses, that he deserved more recognition, more power. But Korah wasn't alone. He knew how to speak to people's frustration. After all, the journey through the desert was hard. Food was scarce, the future uncertain. Every day brought new challenges. And when people are tired, hungry, and desperate, rebellion finds fertile ground. Korah found two others willing to stand with him, Dathan and Abiram from the tribe of Reuben. These men carried their own grudges, their own frustration, and together they became the face of resistance against Moses and Aaron. But this wasn't just a political argument. It wasn't just men disagreeing on leadership styles or strategies for survival. This was a direct challenge to the authority that God Himself had established. And that's where the story takes a dangerous turn. Because in every generation, there comes a moment when dissatisfaction crosses a line, when what starts as questioning turns into defiance. And when defiance targets the people God appointed, it's not just rebellion against leaders, it's rebellion against God. Korah, Dathan, and Abiram didn't quietly express concerns. They orchestrated a movement. They gathered 250 leaders from the community, respected men, known among the people, and together they confronted Moses and Aaron publicly. Imagine the tension in the air, families watching, the congregation holding its breath. These weren't outsiders. These were their own men, respected, influential, standing side by side, united in accusation. And what did they say? They looked Moses and Aaron in the eyes and declared, "You've gone too far. The entire community is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is with them. So why do you set yourselves above the Lord's assembly?" On the surface it sounds fair, even noble. After all, doesn't God love everyone? Aren't all His people called to serve? But beneath those words was pure defiance, a refusal to accept God's chosen order, a dangerous distortion of truth to justify pride and ambition. And here's where the story grips every listener, because this isn't ancient history locked away in the pages of an old book. This is a mirror to the human heart. Pride, jealousy, the hunger for recognition, the belief that we know better, that we deserve more. Korah's rebellion didn't start in public. It started quietly, in the shadows of his heart. A small seed of discontent that grew until it consumed him and infected others. And now, the entire community watched as the confrontation unfolded. Moses, a man known for his humility, didn't respond with anger or arrogance. Instead, he fell face down on the ground. Not because he was weak, but because he understood the gravity of what was happening. This wasn't just a personal attack. It was a spiritual battle, one that would require God's direct intervention. And here's the hook that keeps this story burning in your mind. What happens when you challenge God's structure? When you refuse His design for leadership? When personal ambition outweighs obedience? That's the question hanging over the camp like a storm cloud, and the answer is coming. But before we see what God does, let me remind you, this moment, this confrontation, wasn't isolated to the desert thousands of years ago. The spirit of rebellion still exists today. In workplaces and families, even inside churches, it sneaks in, disguised as concern, as fairness, as justice. But behind the noble words often lies pride, jealousy, and a dangerous refusal to submit to the authority God has placed. Korah, Dathan, and Abiram believed they were standing for equality, for justice. But what they really stood for was themselves, their ambition, their pride, their hunger for control. And the people were caught in the middle, unsure, anxious, watching to see what would happen next. Would God defend Moses and Aaron? Or would He side with the rebels? Would the accusations stand? Or would there be consequences? Stay with me, because what happens next is one of the most shocking displays of divine judgment recorded in Scripture, and the lessons from that moment still speak to every man today. If you've ever struggled with pride, questioned authority, or wrestled with frustration toward leadership, this story isn't just history, it's a warning. A warning that when rebellion rises, so does the hand of God in ways no one can control. And believe me, the consequences Korah and his followers faced, you won't forget them. Korah wasn't just some random troublemaker stirring up division for no reason. He was a Levite, a man chosen from birth for service in God's tabernacle. That's what makes this story even more dangerous. This wasn't rebellion coming from the outside. It was rebellion rising from within, from the very people called to serve closest to God's presence. And Korah wasn't acting alone. He aligned himself with Dathan and Abiram, men from the tribe of Reuben, the firstborn tribe, the tribe that probably still carried the sting of lost status after the family failures of their ancestor. Together, they built a case. They whispered. They questioned. They planted seeds of doubt in the hearts of the people wandering through the desert. And before long, those whispers grew into an all-out revolt. You can imagine how quickly dissatisfaction spreads in a community under pressure. These people had left behind Egypt, their homes, everything familiar. They were living in tents, eating manna, walking through barren wastelands with no clear end in sight. It doesn't take much for resentment to grow in those conditions. And Korah knew exactly how to use that frustration to his advantage. He positioned himself as the voice of the people, claiming to fight for fairness, for equality. But at the core, this was about pride, pride disguised as righteousness. 250 men joined him. Not ordinary men, but well-known leaders from the congregation, influential men with standing among the people. Imagine that, 250 respected figures now standing shoulder to shoulder with Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, directly challenging Moses and Aaron. That wasn't just disagreement. That was organized rebellion. But there's something here a lot of people miss, and this is where it gets serious. Korah and his followers didn't just accuse Moses of being harsh or making bad decisions. They accused Moses and Aaron of elevating themselves above everyone else, of setting themselves apart as if they were better, holier, more chosen than the rest. But here's the truth the rebels refused to see. Moses never appointed himself. Aaron didn't grab power for personal gain. They were chosen by God Himself. Their authority wasn't man-made, it was divine. And that's where Korah made his fatal mistake. His fight wasn't against Moses. His accusations weren't truly aimed at Aaron. The rebellion was against God's order, God's structure, God's decision. And when you cross that line, the consequences are inevitable. Picture the scene. The entire nation of Israel gathered. Families, elders, young men, children, all watching, waiting, listening. The tension so thick you could feel it. Everyone knew something big was about to happen. You could hear the whispers, the debates, the nervous questions. Was Korah right? Did Moses really elevate himself? Could it be that the leadership wasn't as divine as they claimed? But in that moment of uncertainty, Moses does something unexpected. He doesn't argue. He doesn't defend his title. He doesn't flex authority. Instead, Moses falls face down in the dirt, a sign of humility, but also a sign of what's coming next. Because Moses understood this wasn't a human debate to be won with words. This was spiritual warfare, and only God himself could settle it. Then Moses stood up and laid out the challenge that would determine everything. He said, "In the morning, the Lord will show who belongs to him and who is holy." Moses knew there's no need to fight for what God establishes. If God called you, he will defend you. If he set you apart, he will make it clear. The real danger? Testing God, questioning his order, thinking pride and numbers can overthrow his design. Moses proposes the ultimate test. The 250 rebels would take censers, sacred instruments used for burning incense before God, and present them at the tabernacle. It was bold, dangerous, and symbolic. Only those chosen by God were permitted to offer incense in his presence. To do so without his approval? That was playing with fire, literally, but Korah and his followers were blinded by pride. They believed they were right. They believed numbers and influence were enough. They didn't fear the sacred. They didn't respect God's boundaries. They were convinced this was their moment to seize authority, to shift the power structure, to claim equality in the name of rebellion. And that's where so many men today can relate. Maybe you've been there, the temptation to challenge authority, to question the order, to believe you deserve more recognition, more respect, more influence. It feels justified. It feels righteous. But underneath, it's pride. Pride that blinds. Pride that destroys. As the rebels prepared their censers, as they stood before the people, as the nation watched in suspense, no one could predict the magnitude of what was about to unfold. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a leadership dispute. This was a battle for the soul of the nation, a battle between pride and obedience, between human ambition and divine authority. And the people, they were caught in the middle, watching, wondering, fearing. Who was right? Would God really act? Was this rebellion justified? Or would there be consequences too terrifying to imagine? Stay with me, because what happens next isn't just history. It's a lesson every man needs to hear. And trust me, the way God responds, it changed everything in a single moment. The desert was never meant to be comfortable. It was never meant to be easy. The wilderness was a test, a place where God stripped away the comforts of Egypt to teach his people dependence, obedience, and trust. But with every test comes frustration, and frustration, when left unchecked, becomes dangerous. That's exactly what was brewing among the Israelites long before Korah and his men rose up. The people were tired, tired of waiting, tired of the unknown. And when people get tired, they start looking for someone to blame. That's the soil where rebellion grows. It doesn't start overnight. It builds, slowly, through whispers, doubts, dissatisfaction. And when you combine that with pride, the pride of men like Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, you have a dangerous mix that can explode at any moment. Let's talk about where this all happened. The wilderness of Paran. Dry, hot, endless. A land with no cities, no homes, no fields, just rocks, sand, and survival. It was supposed to be the route to the promised land. But after the spies returned with a fearful report, after the people doubted God's promise, that route turned into years of wandering, years of lessons, years of testing. In that harsh environment, authority becomes critical. Without structure, without leadership, the people would scatter, die, destroy themselves. That's why God chose Moses. That's why he appointed Aaron. It wasn't about favoritism. It was survival. But Korah and his followers couldn't see that. All they saw was control, power, status, and they wanted it. You have to understand, Korah wasn't just some hothead with a grudge. He was part of the inner religious structure. His family, the Kohathites, had a special role. They carried the sacred objects of the tabernacle. Every time the Israelites moved, it was their responsibility to transport the most holy items of worship. Korah wasn't excluded from God's work. He was already at the center of it. But pride never settles. Pride always demands more. And so Korah twisted his proximity to holiness into entitlement. He believed carrying holy things made him as important as those leading. He believed his role should translate into authority. He convinced himself, and 250 others, that Moses and Aaron were hogging power, that they were no better than anyone else, that God's presence with the whole community meant everyone had equal rights to lead. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? How often do men look at authority figures, bosses, leaders, pastors, and think, why him? Why not me? Pride doesn't care about calling. Pride doesn't respect order. Pride convinces a man that his frustration is proof that he deserves more. Dathan and Abiram brought their own bitterness to the table. As descendants of Reuben, the firstborn tribe, they carried generational frustration. By tradition, the firstborn son held authority. But Reuben lost that right because of sin. Generations later, his descendants still felt robbed, still felt overlooked. That frustration made them perfect allies for Korah. Together they tapped into the people's fatigue. Remember, these were men living in tents, eating manna every day, wandering without clear direction. Egypt, as oppressive as it was, still held the memory of structure, stability, food. It's human nature to romanticize the past when the present feels uncertain. Korah's rebellion wasn't just fueled by pride, it was fueled by timing. The people were vulnerable, questioning, tired of the desert. And that's when rebellion speaks the loudest. When people are desperate for change, any change, even if it means tearing down the leadership God himself put in place. But this wasn't just about politics. It was spiritual warfare disguised as community concern. Korah stood before the assembly and accused Moses and Aaron of arrogance, of lifting themselves above everyone else. But the truth, Moses never wanted the job. He argued with God at the burning bush, pleaded to be replaced, reminded God of his own weaknesses. Aaron didn't chase power. God appointed him to the priesthood. But pride blinds. Pride rewrites history. Pride paints faithful leaders as oppressors and turns personal frustration into public revolt. Think about how dangerous that is. One man's pride infects 250 others. Those 250 sway an entire nation. All it takes is the right moment, the right words, and suddenly what began as dissatisfaction turns into mutiny, and the wilderness becomes more dangerous from within than from the enemies outside. Moses understood exactly where this was headed. That's why he didn't argue. He didn't debate. He didn't try to win the crowd. Instead, he pointed them back to God, to the only one with the right to decide who leads and who follows. But here's what you need to grasp. The wilderness wasn't just a physical location. It was a spiritual battleground. And rebellion isn't always loud at first. It starts quiet. It grows beneath the surface. It sounds reasonable, even noble. But left unchecked, it brings destruction, not just to the rebel, but to everyone around him. That's the danger Israel faced, not an external enemy, not wild beasts or starvation, but rebellion rising from within, pride disguised as justice, ambition disguised as equality. And the question hanging over the camp, heavy as the desert heat, was simple. Who really speaks for God? Who decides who leads? Is it numbers? Is it influence? Or is it God alone? Stay with me, because what happens next doesn't just answer those questions. It shakes the ground itself. And the consequences, they're unforgettable. The moment every man in that camp had been dreading finally arrived. The whispers were over. The quiet rebellion had exploded into a full-blown confrontation. Korah, Dathan, Abiram, and their 250 followers didn't hide behind rumors anymore. They marched straight to Moses, chest out, heads high, backed by influence, numbers, and pride. To the watching crowd, this wasn't just rebellion. It looked like strength, like courage, like justice, finally standing up to leadership that, in their eyes, had gone unchecked for too long. But here's the thing men often forget. Numbers never override God's authority. You can have the crowd, you can have the loudest voice, but if you're standing against the order God himself established, you're already defeated, even if it doesn't look like it yet. Moses, standing there, didn't shout back. He didn't defend himself like a politician fighting for approval. He fell face down, right there in front of everyone. Now, understand this wasn't weakness. That moment of Moses dropping to the ground wasn't surrender to the rebels. It was surrender to God. Moses knew the weight of what was happening. When men challenge God's order, when pride drives people to attack what God has set up, there's only one option: step back and let God handle it. But Moses also knew something else. This wasn't about his reputation or Aaron's position. It wasn't about personal power. This was a spiritual war disguised as a leadership dispute, and the only way to settle it was to let God's judgment fall in plain sight, so no one could question who he had chosen. So Moses made a declaration, and with it the temperature in the camp shifted. He said, "In the morning the Lord will show who belongs to him, who is holy, and he will have that person come near." You could feel the tension tighten around every man standing there. There were no more debates, no more hidden motives. The line had been drawn, and here's where pride blinds the strongest men. Korah and his followers didn't back down. They doubled down. They believed in their cause so deeply, they couldn't see the cliff they were running toward. That's what pride does. It convinces you you're right, even when you're walking straight into destruction. Moses proposed a test. Simple, but deadly. He told the rebels to take censers, those sacred tools meant for burning incense before God, and to come before the Lord, offering incense as proof of who truly had God's favor. In other words, put your pride to the test in the presence of the Almighty, and let's see who walks away standing. But let me make something clear to every man listening. This wasn't an ordinary ritual. Only those chosen by God could approach him that way. To misuse sacred things wasn't just a mistake. It was an act of defiance against God himself. That's the level of arrogance Korah and his men had reached. They believed their frustration justified crossing lines God himself had drawn. Now, if you've ever worked under authority, at your job, in your family, even in ministry, you know how pride can whisper to you, "You deserve better. Why are they in charge? You could lead better than them." It starts small, but if you feed that pride, it grows. That's exactly where Korah was. He couldn't see straight anymore. He thought proximity to holy things made him untouchable. He mistook religious familiarity for divine authority. Moses, knowing what was coming, tried to reason with them one last time. He called out Dathan and Abiram, tried to bring them back from the edge. But their pride had sealed them in. They refused to even show up, sending their defiance back in words dripping with entitlement and bitterness. They accused Moses of failing to bring them into the promised land, of making himself a prince over them. But every man standing there knew the delay wasn't Moses' doing. It was the people's own fear, their disobedience, that kept them wandering the wilderness. But pride rewrites history. Pride shifts blame. Pride refuses accountability. And pride always escalates the fight beyond logic or reason. By this point, the entire camp was watching. Thousands of eyes locked on the leaders, locked on Moses, locked on Korah's growing rebellion. You could feel it. The suspense, the fear, the unknown hanging in the air like a storm about to break. And that's when Moses said the words that still send chills down the spine of anyone who reads this account. "If these men die a natural death, or if they are visited by the fate of all mankind, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord creates something new, and the ground opens its mouth and swallows them alive, then you will know that these men have treated the Lord with contempt." Let that sink in. Moses wasn't defending himself. He wasn't clinging to power. He was placing the entire situation in God's hands. And the way he phrased it, the ground opening, swallowing them alive, that wasn't exaggeration. It wasn't metaphor. It was a prophetic warning, a declaration that rebellion doesn't end in victory, it ends in devastation. And here's where every man watching needed to decide where he stood. Rebellion feels right when you're frustrated. It feels justified when life isn't going your way. But standing in opposition to God's structure never ends well. Korah and his men stood their ground, arrogantly preparing to offer incense, blind to the fact that they were minutes away from witnessing the most terrifying display of God's judgment their generation would ever see. and you need to stay with me, because what happens next wasn't just punishment. It was a supernatural warning etched into history forever. The kind of warning every man needs to hear before pride pulls him down the same road Korah walked. The same road that ends, not with glory, but with the ground itself turning against you. The silence that settled over the camp after Moses' words wasn't ordinary silence. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that wraps around a man's chest when he knows something bigger than him is about to happen. Something he can't control, can't stop, and can't escape. Every man standing there, from the elders to the youngest, knew this was no longer a debate, no longer a political argument about leadership. This had become life and death. But still, Korah and his men stood their ground. And here's what separates men who fear God from men ruled by pride. Those ruled by pride lose the ability to read the warning signs. They become so locked into their ambition, their frustration, their entitlement, that even when the ground starts to shake under their feet, they tell themselves they're safe. Pride will blind you to the cliff you're standing on until the earth literally cracks open beneath you. When Moses dropped to his knees and put his face to the dirt, that wasn't weakness. That was reverence. That was a leader who understood the danger of standing in the presence of God's judgment. That was a man who feared the Lord more than he feared losing influence, reputation, or control. And right there is a lesson every man listening needs to burn into his mind. Real authority doesn't fight for position, it submits to God. The ground was still for a moment, the camp holding its breath, thousands watching. But beneath their feet, something was building. Moses didn't argue with Korah. He didn't try to negotiate. He didn't pull rank or call for the army. He simply stepped back and made it clear God would decide, not Korah, not Moses, not the crowd. Only God has the right to establish authority, and only God can tear it down. But pride never backs off easily. Korah's heart was too hardened to hear the warning. Dathan and Abiram were too bitter to see the trap they'd walked into, and those 250 respected men, they were too deep into the rebellion to retreat now. That's how pride works. It corners you. It convinces you that turning back makes you weak, that admitting you were wrong means losing everything. But staying in rebellion, that leads to consequences no man is ready for. Moses pleaded with the people one last time, telling them to separate themselves from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. He warned them, "Move away from these men. Don't touch anything that belongs to them, or you'll be swept away because of all their sins." It was a clear, final offer. Get out now or go down with them. Some listened. Some moved away, fear gripping their hearts as they realized how real this had become. But Korah and his men, still standing, still bold, still blind. And here's the raw truth every man has to confront. God is patient, but his patience isn't weakness. His silence isn't approval. His delay isn't permission to keep walking in pride. The moment of decision always comes, and when it does, the consequences hit harder than pride ever expected. The Bible says the earth split open beneath them. The ground, solid 1 second, ripped apart the next. It wasn't just an earthquake. It wasn't just natural disaster. This was targeted, precise, divine. The earth opened its mouth, and Korah, Dathan, Abiram, their families, their possessions, their influence, everything, they were swallowed alive. And the people, they ran. Terror filled the camp. The same crowd that listened to Korah's rebellion now watched the ground consume him. The prideful voices silenced in an instant. The desert, the wilderness, wasn't the enemy. The enemy was pride, rebellion, defiance against God. But it didn't stop there. Fire came from the presence of the Lord and consumed the 250 men offering incense, the men who thought their status, their respect, their numbers would shield them. It didn't matter how influential they were. It didn't matter how respected they were before that day. They stood against God's order, and when the fire fell, there was no escape. And here's where this hits every man listening. You can spend years building a reputation, earning influence, gaining respect. But one decision to stand in rebellion against God's authority can burn it all to the ground in seconds. Pride promises elevation, but it always delivers destruction. What happened in the desert wasn't a random act of punishment. It was a divine reminder burned into history that God doesn't play games with rebellion. He doesn't negotiate his order. He doesn't tolerate pride when it rises against the leaders he appoints. But the most terrifying part, even after the earth opened, even after the fire consumed the rebels, some of the people still didn't get it. That's what pride does. It blinds you so deeply that even when judgment falls right in front of you, you convince yourself you're still right. And that's exactly where this story is heading next. Because what happened after the ground swallowed the rebels proves that pride, once rooted in a man's heart, doesn't die easily. Even witnessing God's judgment firsthand wasn't enough to shake some of them free from their rebellion. Stay with me, because the next part of this story will show you how dangerous it is when men refuse to humble themselves, even after watching the ground itself rise up against their pride. The ground didn't just open by coincidence. It wasn't some freak event of nature. It was surgical, precise, directed by the hand of God himself to deal with rebellion in front of the entire nation. When Korah, Dathan, Abiram, and all who stood with them were swallowed alive, it sent a message that no man watching could forget. The earth literally opened its mouth. Scripture makes that clear. The ground under their feet gave way, and in an instant, the rebels, their families, their possessions, and everything tied to their pride were gone, buried alive as the ground sealed itself shut. Now stop and think about that scene for a second. This wasn't quiet. It wasn't hidden. It happened in full view of the congregation. You can almost hear the screams, the panic, the thunder of the earth splitting apart, people running in every direction, tripping over tents, pulling their families away from the chaos. And yet, as terrifying as that moment was, what came next was even more unforgettable. Because while the ground handled the leaders of the rebellion, the 250 men who followed Korah weren't spared either. They had their own form of defiance to answer for. They weren't swallowed by the earth. Their judgment came from above, fire, direct, consuming, undeniable. Flames shot out from the presence of the Lord, engulfing them as they stood holding their censers, the very tools they believed qualified them to stand in God's presence. It's one thing to fear a natural disaster. But when fire falls from heaven, targeted and precise, wiping out only those who rebelled while leaving everyone else standing, that's a different level of fear. That's when a man realizes he's not dealing with nature, he's dealing with the living God. And here's what cuts deep into the heart of this moment. The censers they used weren't ordinary tools. They were sacred, designed for worship, for honoring God in the tabernacle. Korah's followers used them as a symbol of their supposed right to lead, to approach God on their own terms. But they weren't called, they weren't chosen, and no amount of ambition or self-justification could make them holy. The fire consumed their bodies, but the censers survived. Think about that. Their pride was reduced to ash, but the objects they used to fuel their rebellion remained, untouched by the flames. Why? Because God doesn't desecrate what's holy. The tools themselves were sanctified, but the hands that misuse them, gone. Moses, under God's direction, ordered those censers to be hammered into sheets of bronze, permanently attached to the altar of burnt offerings. Imagine that for a second. The very tools of rebellion reshaped into a reminder, fused to the altar where sacrifices for sin were made. Every time the people came to worship, they saw those bronze sheets, hammered, flattened, fixed to the altar, impossible to ignore. It wasn't just decoration. It was a warning etched into the center of their spiritual life. This is what happens when pride tries to overthrow God's order. This is what happens when men think they can stand in positions God never assigned to them. The altar wasn't just a place of worship anymore. It became a constant visual reminder that rebellion carries consequences no man escapes. And yet, as shocking, as final, as public as all of this was, the human heart is stubborn. You'd think after watching the ground open, after seeing the fire fall, after witnessing rebellion crushed by the undeniable hand of God, the people would fall to their knees in repentance. But pride doesn't die easily. The very next day, Scripture tells us, the people grumbled against Moses and Aaron. Let that sink in. Less than 24 hours after witnessing divine judgment, earth splitting, fire falling, leaders buried alive, the congregation still pointed fingers. They accused Moses and Aaron, saying, "You have killed the Lord's people." It almost defies logic, but that's what pride and confusion do. Rebellion distorts reality. It rewrites truth. Even after God acts decisively, there are those so caught in frustration, in bitterness, in their own perspective, that they can't see his hand for what it is. But God doesn't play games with rebellion. He doesn't tolerate confusion that leads his people into destruction. That grumbling sparked another wave of judgment. A plague swept through the camp, killing thousands in mere moments. And once again, Moses and Aaron, the very leaders the people accused, interceded on their behalf, standing between the living and the dead to stop the plague. Let that speak to every man listening. The same Moses they accused risked himself to save them. That's real leadership. Leadership isn't about status, comfort, or pride. It's about standing in the gap, even when the people you protect turn on you. It's about carrying the weight of responsibility when others only want the privilege of power. KORAH wanted position. Dathan and Abiram wanted status. The 250 wanted recognition. But when the ground opened, when the fire fell, when the plague swept through, only one thing mattered: obedience to God's order. The wilderness wasn't just a physical test. It exposed hearts. It revealed pride. And for those who refused to humble themselves, it became their grave. Stay with me, because the next moment in this story is where God settles the argument once and for all, where he makes it undeniable to every man watching exactly who he called to lead. And believe me, how he does it, you won't forget it. The fear that swept through the camp wasn't ordinary fear. It wasn't like being startled by a loud noise or nervous about tomorrow's journey. This was raw, paralyzing terror. The kind of fear that grips your chest, dries your mouth, and leaves your hands trembling because you just witnessed something that shattered every illusion of control you thought you had. One minute, KORAH and his men stood bold, convinced they could challenge divine authority. The next, the earth opened, the fire fell, and the rebellion was buried, literally and permanently. You would think that would end it. That after watching the ground devour entire families, after seeing fire from heaven incinerate respected leaders, after hearing the cries and panic ripple through the nation, the people would snap back to their senses. But pride has a way of blinding even those watching from the sidelines. Some people watched that destruction unfold and still didn't get the message. And this is where human nature exposes itself, where the stubbornness of the human heart shows just how deep rebellion can run. Not just in the few bold enough to stand at the front, but in the crowd, in the whispers, in the quiet agreement that fuels division from the shadows. The very next morning, despite everything they had seen, the people came to Moses and Aaron with accusations that defy logic. They pointed at the two men God had spared, the two men still standing while the rebels were buried, and said, "You have killed the Lord's people." Let that sink in for a second. The same people who witnessed God's undeniable judgment turned the blame on Moses and Aaron, as if the destruction had been some personal vendetta, as if human hands opened the ground or summoned fire from the presence of the Lord. But that's how deception works. That's how rebellion embeds itself so deep that even the most obvious display of God's authority gets twisted. People start seeing judgment and calling it injustice. They see discipline and label it cruelty. And the real danger? They harden their hearts even more, doubling down on the same pride that almost wiped them out the day before. God doesn't ignore that kind of rebellion. His patience is long, but when people refuse to see, refuse to listen, refuse to humble themselves, consequences escalate. That morning, as the accusations flew, as the crowd stirred in anger and confusion, the presence of God descended on the tabernacle. His glory filled the space, not as comfort this time, but as a warning. Moses and Aaron knew what was coming. They'd seen it before. They knew the rebellion wasn't over, not in the hearts of the people. And they knew, when pride infects an entire camp, judgment spreads like wildfire. The Lord spoke with clarity. "Separate yourselves from this assembly so I can put an end to them at once." It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a negotiation. It was God drawing a line, giving his faithful leaders the option to step back, to let the people reap the full consequence of their pride. But here's the mark of a real leader, and every man listening needs to hear this. Moses and Aaron didn't step back to watch the destruction. They fell face down, pleading for mercy. They begged God to spare the innocent, to distinguish between the rebellious leaders and the people misled by fear and frustration. That's what separates godly leadership from power-hungry rebellion. Real leaders carry the burden of responsibility even when the people turn against them. But the people's grumbling didn't stop, and neither did the consequences. A plague broke out, sweeping through the camp with terrifying speed. Men were dropping, families were panicking. The same people who pointed fingers now faced a judgment they couldn't escape. And in the middle of that chaos, Aaron, the very man they accused, stepped into action. He took his censer, the real authorized censer, and filled it with incense. He ran into the crowd, stood between the living and the dead, and made atonement for the people. Picture that. While others ran from the plague, Aaron ran toward it. He stood in the gap, not because he had to prove his authority, but because leadership means sacrifice. It means risking yourself to save those who reject you. As Aaron stood there with incense rising, the plague stopped. The judgment halted, but the damage was done. Over 14,000 people lost their lives, on top of those consumed by the ground and fire the day before. Let that number hit you. Over 14,000 deaths, not by accident, not by coincidence, but as the direct consequence of rebellion that could have been avoided. Pride promises status, but it delivers destruction. Rebellion feels empowering, but it ends in loss, division, and death. And yet, even with that level of loss, the lesson wasn't fully absorbed. That's how stubborn the human heart can be. That's how dangerous unchecked pride becomes. The people needed more than just consequences. They needed undeniable proof of who God chose, who He established, and who He defends. And that's exactly where this story heads next. Because God doesn't leave His authority in question. When rebellion rises, when pride confuses the people, when death itself shakes the camp, God still steps in to silence every doubt in a way no man can deny. Stay with me. Because what God does next proves, once and for all, who He has called, and when God establishes someone, not even death can challenge it. The problem with rebellion is that most men think it's about the surface. They think it's about the argument, about leadership, about decisions they don't agree with. But rebellion always runs deeper. It's spiritual. It exposes what's buried in a man's heart, the pride, the resentment, the unwillingness to submit to something bigger than himself. And that's exactly what God was dealing with in the camp of Israel after the revolt of Korah. The earth had opened, the fire had fallen, the plague had swept through the people, yet confusion still lingered. Pride is stubborn like that. It buries itself so deep that even after judgment, some men still question, still murmur, still entertain doubt about who God truly chose to lead. But here's the thing about God. He never leaves His order in question. When He establishes someone, He doesn't defend that authority through politics or manipulation. He does it in ways that no one can argue with, clear, public, undeniable. And that's where God took this rebellion next, to a level where even the most prideful man watching couldn't deny His decision. God commanded Moses to gather a staff from the leader of every tribe of Israel, 12 staffs in total. Simple wooden rods, lifeless, plain, symbols of leadership, yes, but in themselves, dead pieces of wood. One staff from each tribe, including a staff from Aaron representing the tribe of Levi. These staffs were placed inside the tabernacle, right before the Ark of the Covenant, the very place where God's presence dwelled. And God made it clear, He wasn't going to entertain endless debates, endless rebellion, endless pride. He said, "The staff belonging to the man I choose will sprout, and I will rid myself of this constant grumbling against you by the Israelites." Think about that. Lifeless wood, dead material, incapable of producing fruit or life on its own. God was about to make the impossible happen, to silence every mouth, to expose rebellion, not with arguments, but with supernatural proof. The staff sat in the tabernacle overnight. No speeches, no debates, no political maneuvering. Just the raw presence of God and 12 dead staffs resting before Him. And when morning came, the evidence was undeniable. Aaron's staff, the one representing the tribe of Levi, the man the people accused, The leader they questioned, it wasn't just sprouting, it had blossomed. It had produced flowers, almonds, fruit, signs of life where there should have been nothing but dead wood. Imagine the camp gathering, men walking in, their eyes fixed on those staffs. 11 lifeless rods lying there, unchanged, still dead. But Aaron's, covered in buds, blossoms, ripe almonds, undeniable proof that God himself had set Aaron apart. Not man, not politics, not Moses, but the creator of heaven and earth. That wasn't biology. That wasn't coincidence. That was divine selection, broadcasted in a way no man could manipulate. It silenced the rebellion because rebellion thrives on uncertainty, on questioning authority, on twisting facts. But when God acts like that, when he brings life from dead wood, there's no room left to argue. Aaron's staff wasn't a one-time sign either. God commanded that it be kept in the ark as a permanent reminder to the people, a visible warning for every generation. When God establishes someone, he backs them with undeniable authority, and rebellion against that is rebellion against God himself. Here's the hard truth for every man listening. Leadership is God's decision, not ours. We can question, we can criticize, but at the end of the day, when God places his hand on someone, it's not up for debate. Pride tries to rewrite that. Pride whispers, "You deserve that role. You should be leading. You know better." But pride doesn't produce fruit. Pride doesn't blossom. Pride doesn't carry God's approval. What blossoms is obedience. What bears fruit is submission to God's order, even when it's hard, even when you think you deserve more, even when your pride screams for recognition. The staff of Aaron wasn't just a stick with flowers, it was a spiritual lesson carved into history. God was showing every man in that camp, and every man listening right now, that rebellion might stir for a moment, pride might rise, frustration might boil over, but in the end, only what God chooses will stand. And that's the lesson too many men miss today. We live in a world saturated with pride, with ambition, with self-promotion. Everyone wants to be seen, to be heard, to lead, but authority without God's backing is hollow. It's temporary. It collapses under pressure. But when God establishes someone, even dead wood comes to life. That's the proof no one could argue with. The moment that silenced every critic, every whisper, every rebellious thought. And it wasn't just for them. It's a warning echoing through time for every man who lets pride fester, for every man tempted to challenge what God has already established. Stay with me, because this isn't just ancient history. The danger of rebellion. It didn't end in the desert. It's still alive today, creeping into hearts, families, churches, and nations. And understanding the fallout from Korah's rebellion could be the key to avoiding the same destruction in your own life. The mistake most men make when reading a story like Korah's rebellion is thinking it's locked in the past, as if it was some isolated event buried in the wilderness thousands of years ago, with no relevance to life today. But the truth is, the spirit of rebellion never died in that desert. It may have changed its language, its appearance, but the same dangerous pride that fueled Korah, Dathan, and Abiram is still alive, still creeping into hearts, still poisoning families, churches, workplaces, and entire communities right now. If you think rebellion is only about standing on a stage shouting against authority, you're already missing how subtle and dangerous it really is. Rebellion starts small. It starts with frustration, with quiet questions, with dissatisfaction that simmers under the surface. And when that isn't dealt with, it grows. It turns into criticism, into jealousy, into whispered conversations behind closed doors, into division that spreads like wildfire. Look around today, and you'll see the evidence. In families, when men refuse to lead and others rise up to challenge the structure God designed. In churches, when prideful hearts reject spiritual authority because they don't like correction, accountability, or direction. In workplaces, when bitterness over promotion fuels gossip, resentment, and disunity. Rebellion wears many faces. Sometimes it looks bold, like Korah standing before Moses. Other times it hides in silence, in bitterness, in passive resistance that chips away at unity from the inside out. And make no mistake, rebellion always promises the same lie. It convinces you that you're fighting for fairness, for justice, for what's right. Korah didn't stand in front of Moses and say, "I'm here for pride." He said, "We're all holy. We all deserve to lead. Why do you get to be over us?" His words sounded righteous. His motives? Rotten with pride. That's the same pattern men fall into today. We dress rebellion up as boldness, as standing for truth, as questioning unfair leadership. But deep down, if we're honest, pride is steering the ship. And here's the warning. Pride disguised as rebellion doesn't just challenge leadership. It challenges God's order, God's authority, and God himself. You see, God's structure isn't up for debate. He sets leadership in place for protection, for accountability, for order. That doesn't mean leaders are perfect. Moses wasn't perfect. Aaron wasn't flawless. But they were chosen. And when God chooses, rebellion against his structure is rebellion against him. The terrifying part is how quickly rebellion spreads. It only took one man, Korah, to infect 250 leaders. Men respected, influential, admired. It only took those 250 to sway an entire nation into questioning the very authority that kept them alive in the wilderness. That's how dangerous rebellion is. It multiplies. It pulls others in, blinds them to truth, convinces them they're justified, right up until the moment the ground opens beneath their feet. And for those listening, thinking rebellion is someone else's issue, here's where this gets personal. Rebellion doesn't always look like standing in open defiance. Sometimes it hides in passive resistance. It shows up when you refuse to submit to godly authority, when you reject correction because you think you know better, when your pride whispers that your way, your opinion, your position is more important than unity, order, and obedience. And the consequences? Still the same. Maybe the ground won't literally open under your feet, but spiritually, emotionally, relationally, you'll feel the cracks. Families fall apart when rebellion takes root. Churches split. Businesses crumble. Nations divide. Pride poisons everything it touches, and rebellion is pride in action. The real danger? Many men confuse rebellion with strength. They think resisting authority makes them independent, bold, self-made. But rebellion doesn't build strength. It reveals weakness. Weak men hide behind rebellion because they can't submit, can't respect, can't follow. Real strength? It's in submission to God's order, even when it costs your pride. Korah thought rebellion would elevate him. It buried him. The 250 thought rebellion would earn them recognition. It consumed them. The people thought questioning authority would empower them. It nearly destroyed them all. And today, that spirit still whispers in homes, telling men they don't need to lead or follow. Just do what feels right. In churches, convincing believers they don't need pastors, spiritual covering, or accountability. In communities, turning disagreement into division, opinion into open rebellion. But if there's one lesson burned into history from Korah's fall, it's this. God defends his order. He backs his leaders. He silences rebellion. Not always immediately, but always decisively. The terrifying part, even after fire fell, even after the earth swallowed the rebels, some still didn't get it. That shows how deep rebellion digs into a heart. It blinds you to truth, hardens you to correction, convinces you the problem is everyone else, until destruction hits, and by then, it's too late. The question every man needs to ask is simple. Am I walking in submission or rebellion? Is my pride quietly steering me toward destruction? Or am I honoring God's structure, respecting authority, embracing humility, even when it's uncomfortable, even when my pride resists? Because the spirit of rebellion didn't die with Korah. It's still prowling, still infecting, still destroying. And the only defense is humility, submission, and a willingness to let God be God, even when his structure challenges our pride. Stay with me, because what happens next in this story proves beyond question that God doesn't just expose rebellion, he protects, he restores, and he makes it clear who stands under his covering and who's standing alone. The most dangerous mistake a man can make is believing rebellion is something that only existed back then, buried in the wilderness, swallowed by the ground, consumed by fire. But the truth is, rebellion never really died. It evolved, it adapted, and today, it hides in boardrooms, in families, in churches, in quiet conversations, where pride replaces humility, where frustration replaces obedience, where men let their ego speak louder than God's word. And here's what most people won't tell you. Spiritual rebellion doesn't always show up wearing the face of a KORAH, standing in public defiance, shaking a fist at authority. Sometimes it looks like subtle criticism. Sometimes it sounds like quiet murmuring behind closed doors. Sometimes it's that voice inside your head that tells you leadership is flawed, that submission is weakness, that questioning every decision is somehow noble. But rebellion, no matter how quiet it starts, ends the same way it always has. With separation from God, with division, with destruction. You can't dress rebellion up as justice. You can't package pride as discernment. You can't challenge the structure God has put in place and expect to come out unscathed. KORAH didn't set out to be buried alive. He believed he was right. He believed he deserved more. He believed his version of leadership would be better. But the problem with rebellion is, it always clouds your ability to see reality. Pride convinces you that you're fighting for fairness, but you're actually fighting against God himself. The ground opening beneath KORAH wasn't about punishment for disagreement. It was about protecting God's order. The fire that consumed the 250 wasn't about silencing questions. It was about reminding the entire nation that spiritual authority isn't earned through pride, ambition, or manipulation. It's appointed by God, period. And if you think that warning was just for them, look around today. How many churches have been torn apart because prideful men couldn't submit to leadership? How many families fractured because someone refused to walk in humility? How many businesses or teams collapsed because rebellion was tolerated under the disguise of boldness or free thinking? The hard truth? Rebellion never stays contained. It spreads, it infects. It takes root in conversations, in attitudes, in whispers, until one man's pride becomes a community's downfall. The same way KORAH's rebellion didn't just cost him his life. It almost destroyed an entire nation. That's why God's response was so public, so undeniable, so unforgettable. And that's why he didn't stop at just silencing the rebels. He made sure the evidence of his chosen authority, Aaron's staff, blossoming with life, remained in front of the people. A constant reminder that leadership is sacred, that spiritual order is non-negotiable, that rebellion always carries a price. It wasn't just about protecting Moses and Aaron's reputation. It was about protecting the people from themselves, from the destructive cycle of pride that starts small and ends in disaster. And here's the moment of reflection every man needs to have. Where is rebellion trying to root itself in your life? Maybe it's frustration with your boss. Maybe it's resentment towards spiritual leaders. Maybe it's subtle resistance to correction, to accountability, to the boundaries God has put in place. It always starts there, quiet, hidden, justified in your mind. But if you let it grow, it always ends the same way, with brokenness, with separation from God, with consequences far heavier than your pride can carry. Real strength isn't found in rebellion, it's found in submission. It's found in recognizing that God's order protects more than it restricts, that his authority isn't about control, it's about covering, that his leaders aren't perfect, but they are appointed, and that challenging them without a clear, godly reason is standing on dangerous ground. The story of KORAH didn't just expose rebellion. It exposed the condition of the human heart, the pride that makes men believe they deserve more, the arrogance that twists dissatisfaction into division, the stubbornness that refuses correction even after witnessing undeniable consequences. But it also exposed God's mercy, even after the ground opened, even after the fire fell, even after the plague swept through. God still gave the people visible proof, still allowed them to live, still kept his presence among them. That's mercy, a chance to humble ourselves before judgment has the final word. The question is, will we take that chance? Or will pride push us down the same road KORAH walked, a road that ends not in influence, not in leadership, but in destruction? You have that decision in front of you right now. As a man, as a leader in your home, your church, your community, you choose whether to walk in rebellion or submission. You choose whether to be led by pride or humility. You choose whether to stand under God's covering or stand alone. And believe me, standing alone, especially against God's structure, is a fight you will lose every time. So if this message has opened your eyes, if it's stirred something in you, I want you to act on it right now. Humble yourself. Reflect on where pride has crept in. Respect the authority God has placed over your life. And more than that, share this message with someone who needs it. Because rebellion isn't just your battle, it's a fight happening everywhere, and too many men are falling without ever seeing it coming. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone you know needs this truth. Because the spirit of rebellion is still out there, and it's time we confront it head on, with wisdom, humility, and the fear of the Lord. Stay sharp, stay grounded, and I'll see you in the next one.